For our next talk, we have Noaa Barki, who will talk about scaling infrastructure as code to developers. Give a warm round of applause that she can't hear.
Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you DevOpsDays Aarhus for having me. I'm super excited to be here and to talk with you about one of my favorite topics, which is how to delegate infrastructure's code responsibilities to developers at scale. Now, the story behind this talk actually began a long time ago. One day, my dear friend Niv, who is also a DevOps engineer in the company that we work for, has invited me to join him to a meetup. And I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. What's the meetup? And he said, I'm not sure, but definitely something about GitOps, Azure pipelines maybe, Flux. And well, first of all, he totally had met GitOps. I mean, come on. But still there was a small problem because I'm a developer and this is clearly a DevOps engineer's meetup. So I told Niv, I'm not sure, I'm like a real DevOps, And Niv completely disagreed with me and he told me that it's nonsense and that he will send me the address and to be there tomorrow at 8. And we went together. And I said, yes, we went together. And it was the best meetup that I have ever had. Why, do you ask? Well, first of all, 2 reasons. The first reason is that it was the first time that I realized how much I love DevOps. And the second reason is because it was the first time that I realized that I believe that every developer should practice DevOps. At least a little bit. So now that I've said it, we can start talking. So hi everybody, my name is Noaa Barki. I am a developer advocate and a full stack developer for about 7 years. I'm also a tech writer and one of the leaders of GitHub Israel community, which is the largest GitHub community in the whole universe. And I work at an amazing company called The Tree, where we help developers and DevOps engineers to prevent Kubernetes misconfigurations from ever reaching production. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because partly my role at The Tree is not only to understand about Kubernetes and what are the best practices, but it's also to understand how you can blow up your own cluster. So with all these insights, today we're going to talk about how you can delegate infrastructure's code responsibilities to developers and still sleep well at night. But let's go back to the meetup. So we went, and obviously I was the only developer there. Everybody felt like they so grown up, like they figured everything in life. They solved all the puzzles. And at first we had a 40-minute session about Flux, which was very interesting. I'm way more a fan of Arbucity, but potato. And then the organizer said, pizza's in the bag, guys. Let's take a short break and then we'll do the panel. So apparently they planned Cloud Native Experts panel where people can ask them whatever they want. And, usually at panels, people are too embarrassed to ask anything. So after a few minutes, one guy raised his hand and said that in the company that he works for, they started to use JFrog registry, and that he is very frustrated with the devs teams in his company because they don't know how to use it. They don't understand why they should use it. And when they don't use it, they get mad because their builds get failed. And then another guy said that he had the same problem, but with security issues. And then another guy said that he's too afraid to add the Kubernetes resources in his company to the application repository because he's afraid that those developers might ruin everything. And then another guy said that he's agree, and those developers, they don't understand, there was the whole discussion about those developers and what are the best practices when it comes to shifting left, because everybody so afraid from those developers. And I was sitting there, kept hearing about those developers and those developers who don't understand, who can ruin everything, who don't care. And I was like, how can they say that? But I was too embarrassed to say something, because I'm one of those developers. And after a few minutes, after I thought about it, I decided that maybe it's not a bug, maybe it's a feature. that I am the only developer here and everybody are DevOps engineers. So I raised my hand and I said, hi, hi, my name is Noaa. I'm a full stack developer and a developer advocate. And may I speak in the name of my people? No, I didn't say that. I asked permission to speak, and my friend Neve was like, I don't know her. Everybody like turned around to see whose voice just got permissions to speak in this meetup. And everybody looked at me. And I said that, you say that we don't understand. You say that we don't care. And you say that we can ruin everything. And you're right. You're right. But first of all, you have to give us some credit here. I mean, at least some credit. And you need to remember that we are different personas. We do different things. We use different tools. We care about different things. And we have different goals. I wake up every morning to be the best feature machine this world has ever seen. I have code to write, bugs to fix, tests to run, and I have the next feature to plan. I also need to review tons of pull requests and to make sure that I and my teammates follow best practices, that we all write clean, nice, readable, maintainable code. I also need to make sure that my code is secure and stable. Why should I suddenly care about those YAML files that you pushed to my repository? What the heck is Terraform, and what is so important to put that memory limit in Kubernetes? How do you expect us to work together on the same pipeline, on the same technology, when I don't even understand it? And then one guy asked me the question that I fear the most. He turned around and said, so, what do you suggest? And I looked at him and I smiled and said, you know what? Let's take Kubernetes and let's talk about how I think you should delegate responsibilities to developers. So, first of all, you need to delegate the knowledge. You need to learn best practices and to teach others in the organization. For instance, whoever here used Arbucity, did you know that if you modify one of the internal config maps of Arbucity, you have to labelize it with part of Arbucity? Otherwise, Argo will completely ignore it. You won't see any errors, it will just won't work. Now, this is one of the best practices that everybody that works in Arbucity should know. So, it all comes down to this. You should learn the best practices and you should delegate the knowledge to the others in the organization. And there are many ways to do it. You can use it by having internal meetups in your organization. You can send newsletters or emails, and you can share other companies' failure stories. Trust me, not only that you will learn a lot about Kubernetes, you will also learn from the mistakes of others, which makes it much more fun. Trust me. But sharing the knowledge, it doesn't mean that you need to make sure that everybody suddenly understands everything about Kubernetes. No. You need to make sure that you do it wisely. So choose your champions. Pick those developers who are most interested in infrastructures, and they will be your ambassadors. They will be your champions. Delegate the knowledge to them. Think about front-end and back-end development, for instance. Every organization has those front-end developers who will never do back-end development. And on the other hand, every organization has those back-end developers who will never do the front-end development because they don't like those pixels and CSS and the styling. It's not for them. But every once in a while, you have those true full-stack developers who do both. These are the kinds of developers that you're looking for because they belong to both tribes. So choose the developers who are most motivated and interested in learning about the infrastructure and delegate your knowledge to them. They will be your ambassadors and they will delegate the knowledge to the rest of the developers. Now, I hear you. You're probably thinking right now, okay, Noah, but I still need to make sure that everything is done right. So now what? And this is where policy enforcement comes into the picture. So I believe in two things. You know what? Let me take it back. I believe in two things. I believe in GitOps and in shift left. I believe that every Kubernetes resource should be handled exactly the same as your source code. And of course, as soon as you identify a mistake, the less it might take your production down. So with this mindset, the way I see it, we should automatically validate our code change, our code resources on every code change, exactly in the CI, exactly like the source code. Now, furthermore, if you will validate your resources with tools that can be used as a local testing library, it can extremely help you nurture the DevOps culture in your organizations. Because developers, they are used to local testing. They are used to write code, test it locally on their machine, and they submit a pull request. And guess what? They expect at least those tests to be ran again in the CI. So allowing the developers to do the same with infrastructure as code will allow you to delegate more knowledge to the developers, and therefore will liberate you from the constant need of fencing every Kubernetes resource from any possible misconfigurations. So it turns out that there are three types of misconfigurations. First of all, we have the syntax errors, which combines all the mistakes that happen due to invalid YAML file or submitting a Kubernetes resource with the incorrect schema. And you would be surprised to know how many tech companies share their own Kubernetes story because they applied a misconfigured YAML file. Now, if you don't believe me, ask Zalando, which is an online fashion company with over 6,000 employees. And what happened to them is that they used the correct configuration, however, they placed it incorrectly in their YAML, which eventually took their API server down and cost them a lot of money. Very sad story. Now, the next type is what I like to call knowledge issues. And it combines all the mistakes that happen because usually we have different personas working on the same technology, and sometimes we lack the knowledge and we don't know what are the best practices with that technology. For instance, when it comes to Kubernetes, you kind of have everybody in the R&D department working on Kubernetes. You have the developers, you have the DevOps, you have the security stakeholders, you have everybody. And usually, very often, not everyone know how to use Kubernetes and what are the best practices. Not everybody know that one of the best practices would be to pin the image Docker to a specific version, because otherwise every time that you will deploy the container you will have a different version, and it's not a best practice. Not everybody knows it. Now, it's important to follow and know best practices, but it's also important to make sure that you are aligned with your team and your organizations. And sometimes you have internal best practices that are more related to the organization that you work for things like using a private registry for your images or to set a specific amount of limit for your containers. Now, we have these three types of misconfiguration. So let's review type by type, each one by one, and see how we can face and handle those misconfigurations. So starting with the syntax error, we want to validate our config file. So first of all, we want to make sure that the file format that we use is valid. Whatever it is, it can be YAML, JSON, XML, Docker file, whatever file format that you use, you need to make sure that the actual format that you wrote is valid. And Yair Zilberman, who is a very good friend and a colleague, highly recommended me to use the YQ, which is an open source and a portable CI YAML processor. And I highly recommend you to do the same and to use it. It's so easy to use. It's fun and very easy. I highly recommend you to use it. And great, so now that we assure that our file format is valid, we also want to make sure that whatever is written in that file is valid as well. So we also want to make sure that the syntax of the resource is valid, i.e. the Kubernetes schema, when it comes to Kubernetes, is correct. Now, there are several ways to do it. The built-in option, which is usually the preferable option, is to use the kubectl CLI with the dry run flags, which basically tell the kubectl to only validate that resource, to not apply it. Now, it's good, but the small tiny issue with this is that it will only work if you have internet connection. The alternative that I want to highly recommend you to use is called kubeconfirm, which is also an open source project, which basically pulls all Kubernetes resources and schemas every once in a while. It allows you to do the same and to validate your resources schemas on offline mode. It's very easy. I like it very much. We even use it in the tree CLI, so I highly encourage you to use it. Great. Now, we also want to make sure that not only that our syntax is good, but we also want to make sure that everybody will follow and align on best practices for things like not setting a memory limit or to forget the liveness probe. We also want to make sure that everybody don't forget to do so. And this is where enforcement best practices and policy enforcement comes into the picture. So first of all, we need to define the policies and the rules that we want to enforce. Maybe we want to make sure that every container has configured a memory limit, readiness or liveness probe, or CPU limit. Maybe it's about cron jobs, that every cron job has configured a deadline or that the scheduler is valid. Maybe it's about setting the concurrency policy to forbid or to replace and never to allow, because when Target did it, it eventually caused their API server down, because whenever a cron job gets failed, it won't replace the previous one, and you will just spawn pods in your cluster, which will basically take your production down. I don't know, but it's important to define all the policies and the rules that you want to enforce, and they're really dependent on the requirements of your workloads. But once you have this set of policies, the real question is, how will you distribute those policies in your CI/CD pipelines? How will you make sure that you and your teammates will follow these best practices? And it's a very important question, because where in the pipeline that you will choose to enforce those best practices and policies might affect your entire organization. For instance, if you will enforce those best practices in the CI, it will affect all the developers' teams in your organization. So make sure and think about it. Take it under consideration. Now, when it comes to policy enforcement, there are two tools that I highly recommend you to use: OPA Conftest and OPA Gatekeeper. They are both open source projects which use OPA as a policy engine under the hood. Conftest is basically a utility which allows you to write unit tests against any structures files, and it's specifically designed to be run as a pre-commit hook, local testing library, or in the CI. Gatekeeper allows you to validate your Kubernetes resources the same way, but natively in your Kubernetes clusters. Now, there are a couple of downsides with these tools. First of all is the Rego language, which is the special language that you need to write your policies when it comes to OPA. All policies in OPA should be written in a special language called Rego, which is the official policy language of OPA. Now, if your policies are pretty straightforward, you shouldn't worry about Rego at all. But if your policies will require some level of complexity, like checking that a key is within a range of numbers, or to check if that key is using a specific kinds of units, or to compare a key to another key, maybe even if in a different file, then Rego will be a little too complicated to use and to implement. But it's really easy to learn. It's a little bit hard to master. The second downside is that when you use Conftest and Gatekeeper both, then you will need to write your policies in a different files. For Conftest, you will have to write all your policies in a Rego file, and with Gatekeeper, you will have to write all your policies with Gatekeeper CRDs, which are constraint template and constraints. So you might have some duplication, and it can lead to configuration issues. But in many ways, these challenges, they can be faced in many ways. And if you use GitOps, if you use Arbucity, then, for instance, You don't really need to use Gatekeeper, and you can only use context, which makes life so much easier. But, and this is important, so pay attention, when it comes to policy enforcement, the most important thing to remember is to do it slow. Start small steps. Don't drop on everybody in the organization gigantic policy enforcement in one day. It should be a process. You should do it in a more gradual way. For instance, that guy that told about the registry, the JFrog registry, he dropped on everybody in the organization JFrog registry enforcement in one day. And he shouldn't have done that. He should have picked one team, have a meeting, make sure that everybody in the meeting understand what is the scope of the policy enforcement, why now, why today, and why at all, and they should agree on that. Then, gradually start to enforce those policies and those rules, and make sure that everybody are aligned with your decisions. Now, the good news is that you have wonderful policy enforcement and that you have developers champions that you can trust. The bad news is that this is only the beginning, because policy enforcement is like your organization. It's continuously living, it's a continuously living thing, and they should continuously evolve and continuously updated according to your organization's needs. So you also need to manage and control your policies in a centralized way. First of all, you need to make sure that you have an easy way to dynamically adjust your policies. You need a place, an intuitive environment where you can implement and modify all your policies. You can use Git for that, but if you ask me, Git is there for version control, not for management. And Git won't provide you anything that you need. Let's take permissions, for instance. How with Git you will be able to control over who can who can create or delete one of the policies. You also need to make sure that you can control, review, and monitor all your policies in your organization. You need to have the observability over which policies are being used in practice. What is the progress and the improvement that your policies are doing in your organizations? And speaking about progress and improvement, to make sure that the policies are actually effective, you also need to provide some guidelines on how to solve these policies. You need to make sure that people actually know what to do when one of those policies gets failed. Because the thing about policies in Kubernetes is that they are sort of like a contract between everybody in the organization. You have the application owners, the cluster admins, and the security stakeholders. And you need to make sure that everybody understands what to do when one of these policies gets failed. So to make sure that your policies are actually effective, you also need to make sure that they are being communicated properly between everybody. So it's really important to provide some guidelines on how to solve these policies. And one way that we see a lot is to send emails, and we saw a lot of companies do it. It's a great way to start, but obviously it doesn't scale. So my fair advice to you is to look for tools that may already suggest and provide you the ability to provide some guidelines. Tools like my very own The Tree open source project. So The Tree is like Conftest, and it kind of combines everything that we just talked about. And it allows you to scan and validate all your Kubernetes resources, but it already comes with built-in policies and rules for Kubernetes and Arbucity best practices. It is specially designed to be run in the CI or as a local testing library or as a pre-commit hook. And the way that it works is very simple. For all files and resources that exist in a given path, the tree runs automated checks, which basically includes YAML validation, schema validation, and policy validation. And if the tree finds any violation, it displays a full output of all the violation that it finds, along with some guidelines on how to actually solve those failures. Now, to use the tree, first of all, you need to install it on your machine, and then you can scan all your files and resources with the tree test and the path of all the files that you want to test. and then you can log into a centralized dashboard application and to modify, to manage your policies, to create a policy, to delete a policy. You can do all these things with policy as code feature. You can get full observability over all the policy executions in your organization, and you can manage the permissions of your policies. And it's open source, it's free, and I highly encourage you to review the code and submit a pull request. I'll see you there. So, to sum up, I really hope that this session inspired you to start thinking about what are the policies in your organization, how will you want to enforce them in your team, with your teammates, and with your best practices and workloads requirement. And I really hope that from this moment on, you will handle your config files exactly the same as your source code. Thank you very much.